It's Thursday night. It is 8 p.m. Central. It is time for Thursday Night Tide on your YouTube and podcast homes for BamaOnline.com. Travis Reier alongside Clint Lamb here for the next 15 or 20 minutes or so. Then we'll be joined by our fellow BOL staffer, Jimmy Stein. We'll go around the table, so to speak, with the three of us for approximately another 10 or 15 minutes. And then Jimmy Stein and myself will close things out leading up to about 8:45 Central or so. We certainly invite your comments and questions as the Alabama Crimson Tide gears up for the 2023 SEC Championship game Saturday afternoon, Mercedes-Benz Stadium, Atlanta, Georgia. Yes, the Georgia Bulldogs on the other side one more time. And I guess, Clint, it never gets old with these two at this point, right? It kind of feels like we haven't seen them together in a long time. We saw them in a stretch of a couple of 3 games there at the end of the 2021 season. We don't see them in 2022. We have yet to see them in 2023. A bringing together of old friends, right?
Starting to feel a little bit like Clemson, Alabama from what 2015 to 2018 or whatever it was.
Yeah, and man, talk about a sort of rivalry that you thought was going to sustain for an extended period of time, and now we're talking about Clemson as more of an 8-win team this season. Got hammered by Tennessee in the Orange Bowl to end last season, so you never know about the sustainability of these things. Although we feel pretty confident with Georgia and Alabama, this thing is going to hang around for a couple of reasons, primarily because they're in the same league. But when you talk about just the way coaches and programs are set up for success, Kirby certainly got the blueprint from Nick. Kirby, a smart football guy in his own right. Kirby, a tenacious recruiter coming up through the ranks and during his time in Tuscaloosa. So I guess we won't see the last of these two with Saturday's game. But there's been so much talk about the college football playoff, how things are going to shake out from that perspective. You almost feel a little bit disappointed for the players and coaches in this game because, yes, it's huge. And when it gets here Saturday afternoon, it'll be absolutely epic. But the anticipation for this game, maybe, Clint, because of the uncertainty and the backlog and the logjam of teams battling for one of those 4 spots, I'm not going to say it's devalued this game, but I don't sense maybe the buzz as much as we've seen in some previous years.
It's interesting that you say that because I kind of feel that too, and that's really interesting. If Alabama wouldn't have lost that game to Texas, it would be winners 1,000% going. With Alabama losing, you would have thought. I mean, you lose to a playoff caliber team, more than likely. I wouldn't say more than likely, but very good chance of making it into the playoffs. In week 2, you would think this would be a win and you're in for Alabama and for Georgia. But it just, there's some things that can happen. And obviously, you got the Pac 12 championship happening tomorrow night. And then you've got Texas and Oklahoma State. I'm pretty sure they're an early game on Saturday, correct?
Yes, the Big 12 game is usually the game that leads off the day, and then you get into mid afternoon with the SEC game, and then you'll have the Big 10 and ACC games at night.
Yeah. So, I mean, Alabama will at least know, and I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. They'll at least know if Texas did get upset, because if they do, now your chances of going are pretty good. That's one of the 2 teams that you need to lose. But at the same time, though, when you look at the actual matchup and stuff, have you been surprised at how many people are predicting blowout, not predicting Georgia to win? There's a reason they're a favorite. They are a really good football team, but it just this idea of Alabama getting blown out
But
is a
has
little
it been
shocking.
more? Has it been more than 2 years ago? Because for me, anyway, I hear what you're saying, that there have certainly been some prognostications that have Georgia winning the game handily. But man, going into this game 2 years ago after Auburn for Alabama and surviving on the plains, it was smack talk, I thought, from not just Georgia people going into this game, but even some of the media that covers Georgia was referring to Alabama's offense as Alabama's little offense and things like that with Bryce Young at quarterback. I thought it was maybe even heightened 2 years ago, but absolutely, in some ways, it feels like that though, because
Well,
Alabama just survived Auburn, kind of stumbles into Atlanta. Georgia is viewed right now as an absolute machine, and with good reason, having won 29 games in a row. But I thought even 2 years ago, I was that was actually going to be my next question for you. Do you think the buildup going into this game is more one-sided towards Georgia as it was 2 years ago? Because, boy, I'll tell you, 2 years ago, it felt like people just thought this was going to be almost a non-conference game in late November for Georgia.
well, and that's kind of I actually was you knew Alabama had a chance. And one of the things that I noticed leading up to that game was the fact that there was so much the Vegas wasn't moving the line. And that was kind of that was fairly telling in my opinion, because typically when Vegas knows something, they're not moving the line based off of a ton of money pouring in. There's probably a reason it should be going in the opposite direction. And you also knew Georgia had that mulligan. They were going to be getting into the college football playoff regardless. So it's like, okay, do you want to reveal too much to Alabama? So there were several reasons that you could point to and say Alabama should have a chance in this one. But there was also a matchup that so clearly favored Georgia in that game where I more so understood, because if your offensive line can't hold up, you're in huge trouble. And everybody had just watched Bryce Young be unable to get anything going all the way until late in the fourth quarter. And obviously, we saw how things turned out. They started getting things going. But then you looked at Georgia's, front that everybody was saying was one of the greatest of all time. And it was obviously very talented. And it was one of the better fronts that we've ever seen in college football. But, I more so understood that there's no matchup in this game. Are there things that favor Georgia? Absolutely, there are. Are there things that favor Alabama? Absolutely. And that's kind of, I don't look at any one matchup and say this is a major problem for Alabama going in. How are they going to overcome this? It's more of, it's pretty balanced in my opinion.
Yeah, you've got this shroud of intrigue too from an availability standpoint, especially with Georgia. And I know Kirby was asked about it on the teleconference earlier today. And as you might expect, he wasn't very forthcoming. He did say that maybe Brock Bowers has done some 11 on 11 stuff this week. Ra
He's
Thomas,
playing.
the wide receiver. Hey, you should. I mean,
He's
why wouldn't
playing.
you? Why
God.
wouldn't you? But at the same time, Nick Saban and the Alabama staff is prepared all week. Someone for Alabama this week has been in a number 19 jersey
Who do you
all
think it would
week.
have been? I don't even know. I mean, how do you? I
Gosh,
was been talking about replicating Jalen Milroe's rushing ability and how difficult that is in practice. If you're Alabama, how do you replicate
Ty
Bowers?
Lockwood? Ty Lockwood out there in 19 this week. I mean, really, who, as you said, who would you put out there
I
in
mean,
that jersey? Because he's not really a tight end. He's an offensive hybrid, an offensive unicorn.
can't have Amari Black playing scout team.
No,
So
but the good thing is you do deal with him. There is some good on good work even during the season. So that does give your guys at least a semblance of a look. And even how Alabama uses Kendrick Law now is it's funny because Georgia uses Brock Bowers like a smaller guy, and then Alabama is using Kendrick Law more and more in some ways like a bigger guy. You'll see him as a hip wingback or a
which
off the
is
ball tight end in some of those formations that Alabama's rolling out there. And then, getting him some of those easy touches like Georgia likes to get to Brock Bowers. But yeah, I think from the injury perspective, just from that vantage point, at least going in, you like Alabama a little bit more than Georgia there. Again, totally expecting Brock Bowers to give it to go. Lad McConkey, we'll see. That McConkey to me seems like the guy maybe least likely to give it a go Saturday. If I were going to prioritize or rank in order of likely to least likely, I think Ra Thomas gives it a go. Tate Ratledge for that Georgia offensive line. So, Kirby said it earlier today, 4 offensive starters that there are questions about. And then when you look at Alabama, seems like right now the biggest thing is Jason McClellan on the offensive side. But after last Saturday, you're going to be very much plugged in, tuned in to see Deontay Lawson, Jalen Key, right? early in this game because you didn't get the sense last Saturday that both of those guys were fully back in lockstep and totally in tune with what needed to happen at the tempo and the pace at which games like last Saturday and certainly even more so this Saturday are concerned.
Yeah, you're 100% correct. And that's an interesting thing to monitor. It's certainly something worth monitoring because, Kendall Milton's playing great football right now. I think 350 rushing yards in his last 3 games and 5 touchdowns. He's not going to be a dynamic pass catcher out of the backfield. I think he's got like 3 catches for 21 yards this year. I think he only has like 11 catches for just over 100 yards in his entire career at Georgia in 4 seasons. But Dejon Edwards handles a little bit more of that, and he's a little bit more of your off tackle runner. So they've actually preferred earlier in the year. It seemed like a lot of outside runs. Here recently, though, a lot of Kendall Milton's success has come between the tackles, and so a guy like Deontay Lawson. Now, I will say I've been probably more concerned with him in coverage than I have as a run defender. If you kind of can keep things within the box, I actually feel like he's still playing pretty good football in there. It's where you start to ask him to move laterally and, scrape over the top of things and do some of that stuff where maybe you're noticing the ankle a little bit more. But having him healthy and Jalen Key, for that matter, in that area, obviously Key's going to work up and play in the box some in some certain situations. He's probably going to be covering Brock Bowers. Obviously, Deontay Lawson's going to be covering him at times too. You would hope that they're both a lot healthier than they were last week. And if they're not, how much of a hindrance is that? Because Auburn really didn't have the personnel to take advantage of that like Georgia will.
Yeah, in the matchups a couple of years ago, Alabama safeties were critical in those 2 games. Jordan Battle, DeMarco Hellams, and both these quarterbacks in this game, not afraid to work the middle of the field either. And so you look at Georgia's 12 interceptions on defense this year between their 2 safeties and their star guy. They have 8 of those between those 3 positions. Georgia's corners so far, I don't believe, have an interception this season. So it's very much safety sub. I think Alabama, conversely, with Caleb Downs, Malachi Moore, Terrion's tied for the SEC lead in interceptions with 5 on the outside, but he also plays some star too. So not all of his production has come at the corner position. So if there is a takeaway on Saturday by one or both of these defenses, Clint, I'm thinking it may very well come in the middle of the field. If you're Alabama, you would love to see a DeMarco Hellams and a Jordan Battle double dip from Atlanta from a couple of years ago, especially Jordan's that went for a pick 6. So, yeah, I think when you look at the running backs in this game in general, Clint, I don't anticipate a lot of explosive runs, not so much because of even the skill sets, but I just think the backs are different for Georgia than even what Auburn presented last week. Hunter and Austin, more probably perimeter oriented. I think Georgia will attempt to run that sort of approach at Alabama. Why wouldn't you as well? But that's not really the strengths of these Georgia backs. But that's where Bowers is so big and McConkey because Georgia will hand it to those guys too. And we saw Javarius Johnson score on a reverse last week against Alabama. So you don't think an end around's coming this week? Sure it is. And that's regardless of whether or not Brock Bowers and or Lad McConkey play or not. Georgia has more than one sort of Swiss Army offensive guy. Dylan Bell is kind of that guy for the Georgia offense. So there's more to account for this Georgia offense with this Alabama defense than just one or 2 guys.
And I think Oscar Delp, he's come a long way, and he's kind of allowed them to
capable.
Yeah, very much so. So he's kind of allowed them to use a little bit more 12 personnel with confidence. And the fact that he had to take over that kind of top role for a few weeks, I think that helped him in his development. And really, you're absolutely correct. I mean, they got weapons all over the place. Now, do they have is it like Alabama's offense, in 2018 and 2019 where you got first round draft picks all over the place? Probably not, but they certainly have those headliner guys who are going to be drafted on day 1. They've certainly got guys who are going to be very reliable NFL players, probably for a very long time. They're going to get drafted at some point. Could be, day 2, could be early day 3, but they got a lot of different options. And, one thing I will say about Georgia, and you have to give them credit, is they've been dealing with some of these offensive injuries to their weapons at various points throughout this entire season, and not one time has it slowed them down. And so, and people like to compare. Okay, Georgia did a much better job than Alabama when their star players went down of having other guys step up. Well, I also think it's the timing of it. If it happens in the middle of the national championship game when you've built your offense a certain way, that's a lot more difficult to do. But through these injuries, I think they've identified guys and figured some things out, gotten some guys some reps and some confidence. So that if Brock Bowers tweaks something on Saturday, they have somebody who's confident and ready to step up. So they're in much better position than maybe Alabama was a couple of years ago. And I think that's important to note too. But when I keep looking at these matchups, assuming the health of Deontay Lawson and Jalen Key, with Alabama's secondary, with their linebackers, the fact Jahad Campbell and Deontay Lawson are typically pretty athletic, good cover linebackers, I don't think there's really any defense that Georgia has faced up to this point that is better equipped to handle all the different ways that they can attack you, more so than Alabama.
Yeah, I think Alabama, just physically in the front seven, should be able to hang in against that Georgia run game well enough. The key's going to be not just that, but discouraging Georgia or getting Georgia away from the quick game, throwing it too, because they'll take all those easy yards you'll give them on those smoke screens and those tunnels and those type of things. You got to get this game into a situation where you can maybe get into the lead and then force Georgia to make Carson Beck work routes that require time to open up down the field. If you want Chris Braswell and Dallas Turner to be real factors in the pass rush this week, it's going to start on those first couple of downs before you get to third, probably more so than anything else. Let's bring Jimmy Stein on now. We'll jump in here with Jimmy. Jimmy, good evening. How are you?
Hey guys, I'm doing awesome. Happy championship week.
Happy championship week. And by the way, I want to get both you guys championship week power rankings. I mean, we know the SEC games at the top of the power ranking, but if you were going to rank these games, and obviously the Pac 12 game is huge, but so is the ACC, but just in terms of games that you're anticipating as a viewer, games you want to watch beyond Alabama and Georgia, I want to talk to you about those. I asked this of Clint too, Jimmy. Um, Moving forward with the 12 game playoff too, coming into effect next year, you're concerned for this game this week being devalued once we expand this playoff. We triple it essentially.
It will be devalued. I think the regular season will also think the focus will be so much on the 12-team playoff. I mean, we could spend a whole show on that. To me, I'm going to be really sad the very first time I hear someone say, whether it's a fan or someone in the media, when Alabama loses a regular season game and someone says, it doesn't matter. I mean, that will just make me sad because there will be some truth to it. It doesn't matter that you just lost a regular season game. And I think what's made college football special all these years is it's the best regular season in all of sports. That's what made college football unique, a better regular season than any other sport had. And now that there's a 12-team playoff, you're losing some of that. It's still one of the best, maybe arguably still the best, but I hate that we're losing that to where a loss is something that you can now easily bounce back from. And in fact, 2 losses can still put you in the playoff. For instance, right now, if the rankings this week were the final rankings and we had a 12-team playoff, Ole Miss would be in at 10-2 as just one example. But Missouri would also be in with 2 losses. Penn State would be in with 2 losses. So you're kind of looking at that 2-loss cutoff instead of the 1-loss cutoff. And who knows, there'll be years perhaps that even a 3-loss team gets in under unique circumstances. So I think the regular season devalued, the championship games will be devalued, especially with the idea, guys, that hey, Ohio State, Michigan, they could end up not only playing 3 times, they could play 3 weeks in a row. I mean, that's very conceivable that could happen 3 weeks in a row. Is that good for college football? It's kind of hard to say, but on the grand scheme of things, I'm sort of looking forward to at least the novelty of the 12-team playoff starting next year.
Yeah, I was thinking today, if you're going into this weekend and you pretty much know you're safely inside, a 12-team playoff, what's the motivation if you got a Brock Bowers that maybe could go or couldn't go? Is there value in playing him or even considering it this week
Positioning.
in a conference championship game? And about the only thing I could come up with, guys, in terms of motivation for these coaches in some of these situations, and you would hope that if it came down to it, they would always do what's best for their players. And I think 99.9% of them would. But you know what these coaches got in their contracts too, right? Incentive bonuses for conference championships. The light bulb, kind of like Rush Probst in 2 days, went ding. So I hadn't thought of that, but that's about all I could come up with, Clint.
I mean, positioning. But
Seeding,
it's like,
yeah,
it's like the NFL. Like once you lock up a certain seed, and you know you're not going to be able to improve your standing, or you're not going to hurt it by losing, you rest your starters. That's what ends up happening. And anybody that does college football fantasy, I still don't think that's fully grabbed hold like NFL fantasy has. But you're going to have some frustrated people watching Jalen Milroe get benched to the final week or even conference championship weekend because Alabama's, which I don't know if Alabama would be the one to do that. Just an example, but it's already a different world. We're seeing it change all the time. And there's going to be some things that come of this that none of us saw coming. I mean, that's just the way that all this stuff works. So I'll be curious to see how it ends up playing out. You know, it's good in a sense where like we would be talking about so many more teams right now being involved. We'd still be talking about, can LSU get in? You know, if they were still in that conversation, would Jaden Daniels be more so in the Heisman conversation? Even if they were on the back half of the playoff picture trying to work their way in, they would be in that conversation. That would certainly help his argument probably, but you'd be talking about a lot more teams, and that's good. That's very inclusive, but at the same time, it is going to devalue a lot of what we've grown to love about the sport. And I'm curious to see how that ends up going.
Yeah. What if you're 9, 10, or 11 going in and you're like, hey, we're the 9th seed today, we're the 10th seed today, but we have to play in this conference championship game. Is this going to potentially knock us out?
Yeah.
If we don't win? We could be knocked out because we have to play, and we'll be replaced by a team most likely that's sitting at home. I think you could see that scenario as well.
Georgia should sit at home this weekend then.
It's true. That's 100% true.
They should. But the college football playoff committee, I think, would appreciate Georgia just going ahead and winning the game Saturday.
Yeah.
Yes. Because that does the committee no favors, I don't think. And I thought it was interesting too, Jimmy, to hear from Greg Sankey earlier today. Nick Saban asked about SEC representation in a college football playoff. The prospect of that not being the case is hard to even fathom. Given some of the things that we know about this league and postseason play. But I guess it's potentially possible anyway, if Alabama wins the game Saturday and, the committee goes with chalk like it seems it likes to do. Can you envision that?
I consider it realistic. I mean, I think the games could fall a certain way this weekend to where it's realistic Alabama would be out if the committee decides we're not going to exclude undefeated teams, period, and we're not going to bring in Alabama without Texas. Just those two things alone could keep Alabama out. So I do think it's realistic that Alabama could beat Georgia and not be in the playoff. It seems absurd. It sounds absurd, and is very absurd when you think about it from this angle. If Alabama beats Georgia, I think Las Vegas would install Alabama as the favorite to win the playoff.
That was kind of Saban's point last year, right? When Alabama got left out in terms of at least 3 of the other teams that were in it.
Yeah, that's right. So having the team that's the favorite to win the playoff, not in the playoff, seems sort of absurd, but it is a real. I think some people have been too head in the sand over it, frankly. I mean, because I think it's very realistic that Alabama could be out. But my guess, as we sit here today, guys, my guess, like, okay, let's make a serious prediction. Does Alabama win and get in? My answer is yes.
As crazy as this sounds, Clint, does the CFP need the SEC more than the SEC needs the CFP?
That's an interesting question.
I mean, of course, you say the SEC needs to be in the college football playoff, wants to be in the college football playoff. But if it's left out in the cold, given the prior success and the history of this league, especially over the last 17 years where national champions are concerned, um, I think if the SEC doesn't get in, the perception will probably be less of the CFP than it will be of the SEC.
Well, and I also think people are always going to question it. I mean, if you leave the
The
SEC out,
validity
yeah,
of the
I mean,
champion this
yeah,
year.
exactly. I mean, it's do you really want that? Because I mean, with the what has the SEC done? There been years where people have criticized the SEC and say it's down compared to previous years and all this stuff. This is not the first time that's happened. Now there's some early season games where people will point to as, the records of the SEC from that as a talking point. But just from Alabama's example, I mean, I could just speak about them. They're light years different than they were in week 2. Not saying that the head to head shouldn't matter with Texas, but I'm saying there are a lot of teams in the SEC that are much better today than they were at the beginning of the year. And, it's just, I don't see, I don't even really know. Every time I start to think about it, I'm like, you think about the resume, you think about everything that the history, it's very difficult for me to fathom a playoff without the SEC given track record and the fact that the best team nobody's questioning right now is Georgia in college football. Alabama, for some reason, is not perceived as one of the best 4 teams by some. But if you're questioning that now, if Alabama goes to Atlanta and beats Georgia, how could you still question that? It doesn't make any sense to me.
Jimmy, getting back to the game on Saturday, I know you and Clint have been knee deep in the matchups the last couple of days here on our YouTube channel. Um, you know, if this thing gets into the 30s or if it needs to get into the 30s, do you think that's a game Alabama can win against this Georgia defense?
You'd almost rather not, I think. I mean, I haven't been comfortable with the idea of a track meet, but I tell you, as Jalen Milroe has improved since week 2, I would feel better about it today than I would back, let's say, end of September, even early October. I think Milroe is more and more equipped to handle that, but Georgia is so elite on defense. It's very difficult for me to imagine Georgia giving up points into the mid 30s. That blows me away. That said, I think Georgia was actually better on defense in 2021 than they are now. And Alabama did score offensively in the mid 30s in that game. And I think Alabama is capable of being that explosive. One thing that Jalen Milroe brings to the table that's so interesting, guys, is not you can't say this about every quarterback in the country, but Jalen Milroe is capable of scoring on any snap from any part of the field 2 different ways. And the list of quarterbacks that can do that is very small. The quarterbacks that can, throw a dime when you're on your own 20 and score from 80 yards out, but also on a scramble play, run not 30 yards, not 40 yards, but 80 yards, outrunning every defensive back on the field that doesn't have a good angle. Milroe can do that. So, yeah, Alabama can get in the 30s just because of Jalen, honestly. So I think it's something Alabama can do. But my advice to Alabama is if they can, I think the sweet spot for Alabama winning this game is scores in the mid 20s.
Yeah. That's where I was at on the predictions. And once again, our staff unanimous in picking Alabama. As I wrote with my prediction, rejoice Georgia fans, because I picked Georgia in the SEC game 2 years ago and then picked Alabama in the national championship game. So that worked out pretty well for the Bulldogs in the end. I think. Hey, Clint, you know, Jimmy makes a good point about not just the dynamic nature of Jalen, but when and getting back to a little bit of what we talked about, you and I earlier, I think if there's even a chance for a 100-yard rusher in this game, if Vegas had odds on that, maybe they do. Maybe they got a prop. I would think Jalen Milroe would be the favorite of these backs, and in quarterbacks to be a guy that could potentially hit 100 yards rushing.
You're 1,000% right. I mean, just with the way that Georgia's vulnerable on the edges a little bit, and I say vulnerable, they're still really good. They're still one of the better teams in college football as far as their edge rushers, but they don't have the caliber of athlete that maybe they've had in some previous years. And, a lot of teams that's had success against them, it's been outside runs, haven't had a whole lot of success inside. And a guy like Jalen Milroe could be a huge part of that. And I think Alabama's game plan going in is going to be to try to keep the Georgia offense off the field as much as possible. Auburn did a pretty good job of that. They were able to run the football. The time of possession, I think it was just barely, but that favored Auburn more so than it did Georgia. That's one way to do it. And if in order to give your defense a rest, and in order to have an advantage in the time of possession, you need to be able to run the football effectively. And a guy like Jalen Milroe is going to be a huge part of that. And that is something that, and I've mentioned this before, out of all the things in this game, to me, the biggest X factor is Jalen Milroe's legs, because it's so difficult to replicate in practice. Alabama tried like hell, I'm sure, to replicate Jaden Daniels as much as humanly possible leading up to that LSU game. And then it's like they've never seen a running quarterback in their lives when they get on the field. It's so difficult to capture exactly how difficult it is to contain a rushing quarterback who has a great feel, but also can threaten you in other ways too, especially vertically, and can throw the football as well. So, I mean, when I look at this game, Jalen Milroe is going to have to be a major part of it. And if you would have told Alabama fans that back in week 2, they would have probably been freaking out. But now, with the way that he's been able to stack performances, do some really good things, he's been avoiding turnovers as of late. I think he's much more equipped now, or better equipped now, to be able to handle the pressure that's going to come on Saturday. And I think that he gives Alabama a pretty good chance to win the football game.
And it almost felt like post-game Auburn that Nick Saban was setting the table for this week and saying, when it's there, go. When it's there, take it. I think Nick Saban wants a decisive Jalen Milroe from the outset on Saturday. And I think even within the script, we're going to see some things in all likelihood that get Jalen going, that don't just leave it on him to make the decision. I think there will be some design quarterback runs in those first 15 or 20 plays, not 7 or 8 or 9 maybe, but enough to get him kind of going in that way that can help that offense, no doubt about it. Hey, so Clint, as we get out of here, I won't ask for your full power rankings for Championship Saturday, but again, beyond Alabama and Georgia, what's the game? Is it tomorrow night? Is it as simple as that? I'm kind of looking forward to that one, I guess.
I am too. They're both ahead of Alabama. So it's like one of them's going to win, one of them's going to lose, and Alabama's going to move ahead of the loser. So from a playoff, now granted, how things look and how things play out could certainly impact things. But for me, it's like the two teams that I think are the most important are two of the Texas, Oklahoma State. Texas should win that game fairly easily, but I'll be interested in watching it. Louisville, the way they lost to Kentucky this past week, I feel like just because Florida State's vulnerable, they didn't look nearly as good, obviously, against Florida this past weekend. Maybe you see Louisville pull off the upset. But, at the same time, it's like when you're putting all your hopes and dreams into Louisville's hands, you're never going to feel good about that. But of course, the Big Ten championship, like, if they want to, I'm just cool with them just not having it and just go ahead and put Michigan in the playoffs, because it's either going to be the most.
Yeah, the Big Ten game should be sponsored by Ollie. The sleep.
It's either going to be the most boring game
supplement
of all time, or it's going to be a slaughter. I mean, either way, it's going to be boring.
You don't want to stay up and watch that Iowa offense? Come on.
I mean,
a minute.
I don't think we've seen the Iowa offense all year.
Hey, Clint, appreciate it as always. Great work all week and all the time for us at BamaOnline.com. Look forward to getting your thoughts during the weekend and throughout Saturday's game and post-game for sure as well and beyond. Clint Lamb, thanks, my man.
Absolutely, fellas. Good talking to you boys.
There he goes, buddy. Clint Lamb out of here. And now it's Jimmy and TR here. Man, did I just go third person on that? That's not good.
Well, you're big time.
Oh, no. Not at all. Hey, Jimmy, you talk about some just crazy streaks. Which one are you more impressed by with these two teams going into Saturday's game? Georgia has won 29 games in a row as a member of the Southeastern Conference. Now we can say, yeah, they're in the Eastern Division. All right, we can throw that little caveat in there if we need to. But Alabama, 8 straight wins in SEC championship games. That's pretty wild when you think
That's
about
got to be Alabama. I mean, I'm not at all disrespecting Georgia's 29 game win streak. I mean, I've seen Alabama win 28 games in a row. I think they did that under Stallings once, and I think under maybe Brian. I don't think Saban's ever won 28 in a row, but Georgia's won 29 in a row. I'm not devaluing that or disrespecting it, but Alabama winning 8 straight SEC championship games, much tougher to do, because not only is it the SEC, which is the best conference in college football year after year after year, Alabama doing it at a time when the SEC was probably at its all-time zenith. I mean, the SEC had never been better as a league during this time period. That's what I think is one of the more underappreciated facets of the Saban era, Travis, is that Saban has dominated the SEC at a time the SEC dominated college football. I don't know that we appreciate that enough.
Yeah, I guess we're old enough to remember when it was basically flipped too, right? People looked at the East as maybe the
Yeah.
stronger of the two divisions when you had
Mhm.
Fulmer doing his thing at full crescendo in Knoxville and Spurrier in Gainesville. It may have been more of a two-team division even back then, but
Good.
it's been largely the West too. When you talk about these SEC champions, I know Georgia's been able to get it done here. But boy, Alabama a couple of years ago, LSU in 2019, kind of go down the list. The Western Division has been very, very stout. Let's get Richard on here and see what he has to think on Thursday night Tide. Richard Coe says our D line has to play much better this week. Auburn took our linebackers out of too many running plays with motion and shifts. What do you gentlemen think? Yeah, I would say so, Jimmy. Missed some fits really throughout that game, and I get you with some of the stuff that Hugh Freeze will give you, but I also thought this too. I thought Auburn's tight ends did a real job on Alabama's
Hmm.
linebackers, and that helped a lot for Hunter and Austin in that run game, and then in the second half, kind of get you out of both ends. You stop the backs a little better in the second half for Auburn, and then Peyton Thorne starts hitting you with draws and zone keeps and those type of things.
Yeah, Richard made a really good observation there, particularly about the defensive line having to play better. Went back this week and made a post on the roundtable message board on BOL where I looked at total tackles and assists by the defensive line group as a whole in every game, every SEC game, and he's right. It was a season low 3 assists, just 3 assists in terms of assisted tackles from the entire defensive line group, and I believe 8 solo tackles, most of that was contributed by Justin Aboigbe himself. But 8 tackles, 3 assists. That's only 11 total tackles, which tied a season low for Alabama in an SEC game. So Auburn did a great job of taking Alabama's defensive line and sort of minimized their impact in the run game. And I tend to think, Travis, it was a little scheme. And again, the motions and shifts that Richard is talking about, I think are a huge factor here. Also think Auburn, we probably as a whole sort of underestimated how good Auburn is running the ball, period. They ran for 219 against this Georgia team, and now 244 or so against Alabama. I think it's going to look a little different this week, Travis. I think Georgia's not going to fool Alabama. I think any success Georgia has won't necessarily be schematic so much as it will just be dude on dude. I mean, I think Auburn knew, hey, we got to come up with some wrinkles. We got to do things a little differently. We got to confuse Alabama a little bit. Georgia's not going to confuse anyone. I think they're just going to say, our guys are better than your guys. Let's play straight up here. Because I think that's how Alabama prefers to play, because Alabama is usually better than the opposition. This week, it's a little bit more clash of the Titans. But I think Georgia's going to play pretty straight up, and so will Alabama. And, man, it's going to be fun to watch. But I don't think they'll be as schematically diverse maybe as Auburn was a week ago.
No, I think Georgia will pretty much be Georgia, and why wouldn't they be? It's been good enough. And look, you know, Kirby knows what he's going against. I mean, he recruits against these guys. He knows the staff and the way it works, and the systems line up a lot. Georgia's going to come out and look to control the line of scrimmage, but also hit the perimeter early. It'd probably be more in the quick game, and that's where Alabama should be in pretty good shape. Maybe in comparison more so than just the last couple of years. Against those screens and those things where Terry and Arnold and Kool-Aid have got to really show up physically and technique sound and limit those plays and kind of discourage Georgia to get away from that and make Georgia more of a predictable offense in terms of we're going to run the football and then play action off of it or do those different kind of things. But that's why it just, to me, it can't be overvalued enough, the availability of a couple of these guys, because we talk about that Auburn Georgia game from early in the season, and that was when Georgia was pretty whole. McConkey had a big game in that game against Auburn, as I recall. Bowers had a big game in that game. So you start taking some of those pieces out of this offense. Dom Lovett, probably undervalued as a receiver, and I think on third down, that's probably where he would show up the most. But those are huge, huge pieces. And then, for the Alabama secondary, I'll be very fascinated to see how Alabama goes about defending Georgia if Bowers is on the field, especially because Delp's good enough too at the tight end position. Your inclination is to go bigger against two tight ends, but those are the kind of guys, not just Bowers. Delp can make you pay for that too. If you do that with some matchups, gets you more against, a linebacker or a safety type. I think Alabama, as much as possible, would love to get Caleb Downs or Malachi or one of these guys matched up in some obvious passing situations with those type of receivers.
Yeah, I think the Brock Bowers matchup, I mean, it's fascinating. I think the NFL scouts on Saturday will look forward to this game just as much as the fans, because they want to see some of these one-on-one matchups they're likely to see. And one of them that's going to be exciting to them is Caleb Downs on Brock Bowers. Caleb's not in their notes just yet. He's not on their boards just yet. But trust me, they know who he is. They've heard of him. And they want to see this freshman matched up against the best tight end in college football. And I do think Caleb Downs, of all the Alabama DBs, is the one most equipped to cover Brock one-on-one. We won't see it the whole 60 minutes. If Alabama's smart, they are, they're going to mix it up. There's going to be some different things that they do with Brock Bowers to not make it simple for him. But we will get to see the one-on-one Downs on Bowers. We'll get to see one-on-one Dallas Turner on Amarius Mims. And boy, the scouts will be watching that one close, because you're talking about two guys that are definitely going to be high selections in the next draft. So those matchups will be all over the place, not just those two, many more. Maybe the outside receivers on Ladd McConkey. People think of him as a slot. He's really not. I think Clint pointed out on our show the other day that Ladd McConkey plays less than 1/3 of his snaps from the slot. He really plays
I think
outside.
They work Lovett more inside, and Dylan Bell is more of that kind of between the numbers guy. Yeah.
So we'll see how Alabama defends these guys. Georgia, I think, is better offensively because they're more diverse, and Carson Beck is such a gifted passer from the pocket. I think Georgia's a little better offensively than their last two teams that won national championships. I think defensively, maybe a step back. It's just made up for by the fact that the offense may have taken 2 steps forward.
Yeah, I think you have to go back to Ojulari, the edge for Georgia. That was a true dynamic edge pass rusher. I mean, even Trayvon Walker and some of those guys, Beal, the last few years, they were big dudes and they were problematic, but they weren't twitch guys, I guess you could say, as pure edge guys. And Now, I don't think Georgia really has that this time around, but also if Jace is limited for Alabama and you start getting into some blitz pickups, because you'll watch Georgia's linebackers throughout the years and they'll get involved in the pass rush. Nakobe Dean, some of those guys, you got to be able to step up in there if you're Roydell and Jam and possibly even Justice Haynes. So let's talk a little bit about what's coming after this game. Saturday's big enough. We shouldn't need to do this, but it's hard not to think about, Jimmy, when my timeline is nonstop portal already. And just the quarterback position around college football, and the potential for how it's going to strike every team. I know the group of fives and the teams on the lower end of maybe the power fives have been pretty vocal about, hey, it's about to go to a whole nother level. And I get their concern, especially, but it's not just going to be limited to those teams. And I think the preference of programs like Georgia and Alabama is to continue to cherry pick, but it's going to be contingent on, right, how hard they get hit by the portal with guys going out the other way.
Yeah, the numbers are different than they used to be. I mean, we got used to a set of numbers in college football. You sign 25 a year, you can't go over 85. Now I think those numbers, they're not, well, the 25 number is literally no longer. The 85 number is sort of plastic, I would call it, with NIL out there. So really the way I look at the numbers and the portal and signing day is sort of like in for out, meaning that, okay, however many players you lose in the portal, however many players you lose to the NFL, that's the same number you got to bring in. So if you lose more players than you expect to the portal, you probably have to address that through the portal, because your high school plan has sort of been going on for a year. You've sort of already sort of planned out, Alabama's going to sign between 21, 26 kids out of high school. But what happens if, well, you lost 30, 20 to the portal, 10 to the draft? Well, you're going to have to address that through the portal. You're not going to go back and take high school kids that are still available in the late signing period. No, you're going to go to the portal where there's talent. So it's sort of malleable and plastic in terms of how many you're looking for, or how many you can take. I think we've already been asked on the board, people like, hey, Mods, is Alabama going to be interested in this guy or this guy? It's very difficult to answer. I mean, my answer for a lot of them is, if you're asking me, is Evan Stewart good enough to play for Alabama? The answer is, of course he is. But if you're asking me, is Alabama going to actually do all that's required to do to bring him in? I don't know. That's a complicated, moving question.
And if he's a one-year guy, what does it do to the rest of your room?
Correct.
Potentially.
Yeah, who's leaving from the wide receiver? Do you really need to bring in a wide receiver of almost any talent level if you've got Bond coming back and you've got Jalen Hale going to make a big step, and Kendrick Law and Kobe Prentice? Do you want to expend the resources?
Yeah,
that's a part of this too. In terms of bringing in a wide receiver when you got all that coming back, but guys could unexpectedly hit the portal, and now all of a sudden bringing in a wide receiver one becomes a huge priority. So it's just kind of difficult to answer these questions, and I don't envy these coaches that to some extent have to make these huge decisions on the fly. You've been working on your recruiting board for over a year, but the transfer portal board happens and moves fast because the elite talent guys, they might not be available very long.
Well, we've got Saturday before we have to worry about all that. But I see, based on your score, you're expecting just an absolute nail biter. 28-27, you have it. I'll take that to mean you think Alabama will be a little more efficient in the red zone. That's the way I'm going to look at that, Jimmy.
Perfect. That's literally read my mind. That's literally behind my score that I picked. I think for Alabama to win this game, Travis, I mean, for Alabama what do they have to do to win? I like keeping things simple, and it's this simple. When you get in the red zone, it needs to be 7. You probably won't get there a lot. You're not going to be there all game. But when you get there, it needs to be 7. And you win the game, because when Georgia gets there, and they will, a couple of times, you got to hold them to 3. So force some red zone field goals. Avoid, hey, this might be a game where we're comfortable with Will Reichard breaking the record on the extra points. I think he only needs one, frankly. But 7s for Alabama in the red zone, a couple of 3s for Georgia in the red zone, and Alabama can win the game maybe by a point.
Couple of red zone field goals for Alabama last week almost went a long way in them losing that game at Auburn. But a red zone stop in the fourth quarter paved the way for them to even have a chance to win it on the miracle from Jalen Milroe to Isaiah Bond. I've got it 27-23. I'm thinking about along the same lines as you in terms of I think Georgia kicks one more field goal than Alabama does. Perhaps it's in the red zone. I think it's going to be that tight. I think the X Factor players are going to be fascinating to watch play out between Bowers and Kendrick Law and even Dylan Bell for Georgia. And I think you still consider Jalen an X Factor because his legs to go along with his arm and that vertical passing game can be such a big part of this thing. Well, Jimmy, we kept you past your allotted time. I know your representation will be in
Past
touch
my
with me.
bedtime.
I'm getting texts from your representation right now that I'm over the time. No, as always, man, enjoy it.
It's great. Enjoy it. And man, I just appreciate just being on the show and listening to you and Clint.
Oh, no. You add so much to this and everything we're doing right now at BamaOnline.com. Thanks, Jimmy. And also thanks to you for tuning in and interacting with us too in the comments. We always appreciate that. You want to hang out with us at BamaOnline.com. We have a huge weekend upon us. Coverage from Atlanta. We've got recruiting that's a byproduct, obviously, of all this as well. And that, as we teased earlier, just takes us into a crazy stretch coming up Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, and beyond. Right there with us at BamaOnline.com, the roundtable, our premium message board of choice. You want to post up right there too. For Jimmy Stein, Clint Lamb, Travis Reier, thanks again for joining us right here on Thursday Night Tide. And until next time, so long, everybody.